Welcome to Podforest, where forest pros discuss forest woes. Our goal is to communicate with private landowners on a variety of forest health issues to support management and stewardship of your lands. In this podcast, we'll be discussing important topics in forest health with experts in multiple fields. Thanks for tuning in, and enjoy this episode of the ProForest Podforest. All right, welcome back, everybody. Today we're joined by Caterina Villari, an associate professor of forest pathology and the co-director of the Southern Pine Health Research Cooperative, joining us from the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Georgia. Caterina, thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Tyler, for having me.
Of course. You're our first pathologist. I've been trying for quite some time to get a pathologist on the show, so thank you so much. But I think some people might be interested to know, what exactly does a forest pathologist do?
All right. Well, as pathologists, we work with diseases of trees as a forest pathologist. And so anything that goes from biotic factors like fungi, bacteria, viruses, any potential biotic agent that affects forest that is not an insect. If it's an insect, then if you work with insects, you're an entomologist, but anything else usually falls under the pathologist. And so diseases of an insect, of trees.
So we haven't had a whole lot of talk on fungus yet. I've sort of joked a little bit about fungus here and there, and some of our other guests have just kind of haphazardly mentioned it, but we haven't had anybody with any expertise in fungi yet. So I was hoping you could kind of clear up what role or roles do fungi play in the sort of forest ecosystem.
So they're actually very critical. They can be very good players and very bad players, basically. Among the diseases, the causal agent of diseases, actually, fungi in the forest environment are the most important. So the majority of the diseases that affect forest trees are caused by fungi. And so that's why in forest pathologies, they are kind of very critical. Fungi or fungus-like organisms like Phytophthora, but they're all within this bigger umbrella of fungi, or they behave like fungi. And so they're very, very important. Now, when I say they can also be beneficial is because they're also decomposers. So a lot of, biomass decomposition will be done by fungi. So they are part of the ecosystem, part of the environment. They help recycle all the nourishment in the soil, break down dead material. Otherwise, we'll have only piles of dead wood staying there forever if it wasn't for fungi decomposing in it. But again, in addition to the just decomposers or fungi, very important as mycorrhizae, also organisms associated with the roots that help the tree thrive because they provide more nourishment, protection to other fungi from other diseases. They help capture water in a better way. But unfortunately, there's also all the pathogens. They play this dual role in the ecosystem.
So to kind of break this down, so they certainly beneficial as decomposers, but they also can harbor a lot of different diseases, and that's kind of where those negative aspects come into play.
Yes. So different species will have different roles. Some species will be beneficial. Some are the one that we might know better because they're so detrimental are the one that cause disease.
And so I hear quite a bit about outbreaks, mostly with insects, but I've also heard the same when it comes to diseases and fungus. How do fungal outbreaks occur and how do they spread?
So we refer to outbreaks when we have a population of a certain pathogen that causes disease goes and grow above a certain threshold level. We have to consider that if we're considering, native species that are normally present in the environment, they're always going to be there and they're always going to cause some damage, kill a little bit here, maybe damage a little bit of tissue there. But in the overall equilibrium of the forest, they're still within an acceptable threshold. When this disease goes above a certain threshold and is not more in equilibrium with the rest of the environment, then we have an outbreak. And then usually when we have outbreaks, it's when we start seeing the actual damage. When organisms are below a threshold level, we kind of include them in the whole picture of the natural system. Mm-hmm. And so fungi spread through spores. They produce spores. That's the way that they diffuse in the environment. And that's how they spread from tree to tree. Now, the way of spreading, it's usually very specific to different types of disease. A little bit if you want to think of like a parallel with human health, you're going to have airborne disease, you're going to have disease that you catch if you touch something infected. And it's the same for pathogens in the forest world. There are going to be some diseases that spread through the wind with spores flying through the wind from, tree to tree, or there's going to be disease that spread through the contact of roots underground. And so every group of, type of disease will spread in a different way. And that's how you have the infection of new hosts and the development of symptoms. And if this, escalates to a level that it's at an outbreak level, that's how we say it. It means that it's infecting a lot of trees above what will be the normal, biodiversity present in a forest.
Hmm. So we had Ken Raffa on recently talking about tree resistance, mostly in a entomology context. How do trees defend against pathogens and fungal outbreaks?
Well, this question is very dear to me because this is mainly my major expertise, tree defenses, and it's been all what I've studied for all my PhD and part of my postdoc. So they defend similarly to how they defend to insect. They will produce what we call secondary metabolites. Those are substances that are toxic to the fungus, or maybe they slow the growth of the fungus. So this is there are different class of compounds. The most common, if we think of pines, this is the type of organisms I work the most, are going to be terpenoids and phenolics, all different classes of chemicals, and they're produced by the plant. Now, there are two ways. There is what we call constitutive defense, and so the plants always have those type of compounds. They're always there, either the agent, the pathogen, it's present or not. They're always going to be protecting themselves, like a barrier that you always keep up as a
Hmm.
protection. And then there is another type that is called induced defense that are only produced after the fungus kind of trigger the production. So kind of a response to the presence of the pathogen. It's not that one is more effective than the other. They kind of serve different purposes toward different type of, damage and attack.
So when it comes to the spread of fungus and, trying to prevent this outbreak threshold, how exactly do we manage our forest to try and keep that in check? Because you said they kind of operate in equilibrium or a balance to kind of keep that down. But as we're trying to proactively address this issue, hopefully proactively address the issue, how do we go about doing that?
Well, there's different way we can manage for, fungal diseases. In forest ecosystems, we don't have the flexibility or the option that we have in other systems like in crops, where usually you end up, spraying a fungicide.
Hmm.
In forests, luckily, so we usually don't go that way. We have other ways of managing and avoiding the pathogen going above that threshold and creating an outbreak. Some of the most effective ways that we try to use is resistance in the host, especially when we're dealing with native pathogens, so that they've been always in the area. They're not, invasive from other area of the world. If they're native, it means that they co-evolve with the host, and so the host
Hmm.
has certain level of resistance to those pathogens. And if we're able to select families or lines of those plants that are being more resistant, then we can deploy those in the environment. And so we kind of use host resistance as a very effective management way. And that is what we use, for instance, for some of the most important diseases of pine plants that we have. Rust, fusiform rust would be number one disease that we have for pines, but we manage through the use of resistance lines. And so it has been very effective, very successful system. And it's all, predict on the fact that the plants do have a certain threshold of resistance. And if we maximize that through breeding, we're gonna have
Hmm.
plants that are still can get infected, but the level of infection gets below that, threshold of damage that otherwise we will have. The other way that we try to use is keeping the plants healthy. So through, silviculture management, thinning is very effective. Fertilization in some cases. Now, for some diseases, fertilization might be tricky, but in other system, it kind of, keep the plant healthy and happy. And the more the plant is healthy and happy, the more it's able to naturally fight back the infection of fungi.
And so if we're reacting to an outbreak, is it just full on sanitation? How can we respond if we are a little too late, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a good point. Sometimes, yes, sanitation is what we end up to have to do, again, because we cannot go out and spray a bunch of fungicide on an open forest, and sometimes it's just not effective. If you find yourself in a situation of, heavy outbreak already, sanitation is is usually the way to go. But you can try to, if you're in an in-between level, let's say you have an active infestation of a disease, but it's not as severe to, grant sanitation, you can try by thinning. Sometimes thinning help. You thin focusing on, removing the trees that are more symptomatic, and you
Hmm.
kind of hope that the one that remains kind of, get better by having less competition, and they were already maybe showing less symptoms, and so maybe they were already either less infected or more resistant, and so you're focusing on those that have better chances to survive and do better.
And so to be clear, sanitation in this case is clear cutting, complete removal.
Yes. In my mindset, I'm thinking of, commercial pine
Hmm.
plantations. And so that
Sure.
will be, clear cutting. And again, you have to remove the infected host. And sometimes just removing the host is not enough. You have to, remove a buffer zone around
Sure.
so that you're sure that even the plants that do not show symptoms yet, they might already be infected, just not symptomatic. And so you need to remove those as well. Cut and sanitation is unfortunately the best way for many, many different diseases.
Hmm.
Once the plant is infected, there's very little you can do to, salvage that or cure that plant. Now, this is in forest settings. If you're in urban setting, it's a little bit different.
So do insects have any sort of relationship when it comes to spreading fungus?
Oh yeah, they do a lot actually. Depending on the disease, there are certain diseases that are entirely vectored by insects.
Mm.
So the insects will, leave a infested plant being completely covered from the spores of this disease, and that's how
Mm.
they. And then the insect will go fly on a new healthy host, start feeding on the healthy host, and as they feed, they open wounds where the spores of the disease that is carried around the insect will germinate and colonize the plant. Well, the majority of vascular diseases, for instance, the most famous is Dutch elm disease that
Hmm.
decimated elm from Northern America, or more recent laurel wilt. All those are spread by insects, basically.
And when it comes to an invasive pathogen, considering that this pathogen didn't evolve or co-evolve with a host, is the real sort of procedure just sanitation in that case and monitoring?
Yeah, so with invasive pathogens, the theory should be the same. It's just that you have to be way more aggressive. Basically, you have zero tolerance for the presence of the
Right.
pathogen. While with native pathogen, as long as you go below a certain threshold, then it's okay. With
Hmm.
invasive pathogens, you try to possibly eliminate it entirely because even little amount can re-spread and recreate an outbreak. And so, while the theory it's more or less similar, is just the level of aggressiveness that you have to use in your management. Now, unfortunately, it's not that easy to eradicate an invasive pathogen. So far, I am not aware, and there might be out there, just they don't come to my mind right now, but I'm not aware of a successful system of an invasive pathogen that has been eradicated in time.
And so when it comes to the introduction of an invasive pathogen, we've talked a little bit about invasive species on this show and how global trade is connected to their spread and all that kind of stuff. How does a pathogen, an invasive pathogen, show up, say, across the ocean? How can it survive travel?
It's same as with insects to trade. The disease somehow it's in an artifact in some material, usually very common, unfortunately, live plants. So the transportation of live plants for
Ah, yes.
uh, nursery gardens, ornamental trees.
Mm.
Live plants are perfect carrier of diseases, and those diseases go undetected because maybe the native host is resistant to it, and so it harbors the disease without showing symptoms because it's
Mm.
co-evolved. But then as soon as the plant arrives in a new environment, the disease can escape from that plant and will find hosts that are naive and so highly susceptible, and from there it will spread. So there is, I think there was actually a professor from Florida that looked at survival of spores in the air after, fire events that will bring the spores higher in the atmosphere. And they were able to show how some spores of those pathogens are able to travel longer distance than what we expect. So this will be kind of
Mm.
a natural way, but that's kind of a unique example. Other than that, there's no way a fungus or a fungal spore will survive, across the ocean. It just doesn't happen. And so the only way that it can get from one way to the other is through humans. Yeah, I would say trade is the number one way of entry. And unfortunately, live plants, trade of live plants or nursery and ornamentals, that's the number one way of entry for diseases.
It's pretty interesting to think that a seemingly minimal or minor behavior like having a little wooden artifact or maybe a leaf or something like that, something that minor could have such major biosecurity implications. So you had mentioned a few different diseases, and I was curious if we could just, in your opinion, perhaps talk about some of the main diseases that forest landowners here in the South should probably keep an eye out for and what those symptoms might look like.
So if we're talking of southern pines, which will be the majority of landowners here, fortunately, the major diseases that we're dealing with, they're all native right now for
Hmm,
pines, and so that's a good news. I mean, unfortunately, the non-native disease is always around the corner, so there's none until one arrives, honestly. But at the
right.
moment, we don't have any major invasive problem, and so the major diseases that we're dealing with are the one that have been present here for the longest time and many land managers are very familiar with. So we will have fusiform rust and heterobasidium root disease, pitch canker. So those are
Mhm.
the bigger one, and they've been here for a long while, so we kind of know how to manage. One that is kind of becoming more prevalent right now, it's brown spot needle blight, which it's native, it's been in the air for a long time, but it's kind of emerging problem for loblolly. So it's a new problem on loblolly. It used to be not problematic on loblolly, but problematic on other species like longleaf,
Mm,
historically very well known. But lately, in the last, I would say, 10 years, a landowner has started to, notice more and more damage, which wasn't expected. In the books, it was not, you would not find it. The first time I was teaching my Forestry class, I would not list loblolly as a potential susceptible species. Well, now, we have to update ourselves and change the narrative that we're putting out there because now it's pretty obvious that it's aggressive on loblolly as well. And so this is kind of a new one to be on the lookout in terms of conifers. In terms of hardwoods, here in Georgia, where I am, we haven't detected yet, but I know that in the surrounding states it has. For instance, South Carolina, it's already well established. It's oak wilt, so a disease of
mm,
oaks. And so symptoms, well, they're different for each of those diseases, but for instance, on conifers, for let's say brown spot, I would look for a sparsing canopy, kind of homogeneously distributed. The needles turn more, discolored brownish. They will tend to fall earlier. So the whole stand is basically becoming more sparse and more less vibrant in color, basically. And it's kind of very, very homogeneously distributed across the canopies.
hmm.
And so that will be an indication that maybe brown spot is there. Then I will have to, go and look more closely at the needles. This is a pathogen that goes on the needles only, so you'll find like characteristic lesions on the needles. Well, for pitch canker, which again is very prevalent in the region and is very aggressive on slash pine, for instance, you will still have symptoms at the canopy level, but instead of having it, homogeneously distributed in all the canopy, what you'll see is single branches dying. Single branches here and there, maybe all across the stand, but not the damage is not kind of homogeneously distributed throughout the canopy. It's single
Hmm.
branches here and there that they become red, they die, they produce a lot of resin, and the needles will remain attached to those terminal branches because the resin keeps them attached there. Even after they're dead, they're caked completely in resin and they'll remain attached there. And so it's what I usually look for, and it's very obvious that you're dealing with pitch canker when you have those singular distal branches dead with the needle still attached there and all resinose.
So if a landowner starts noticing these sorts of symptoms, just kind of strange things happening, and they're suspecting perhaps some sort of outbreak, what should they do about it? Where should they go?
I think in this case, you're like the county agent would be their best person to reach out to. They would have a better understanding of what's in the rest of the territory, and they will have recommendations that are specific from that area. So that would be my suggestion. They are trained to recognize those major, pests and pathogens of the area, and they are in constant contact with, the university, and they're up to date on what is going on. And so those would be the person to really reach out, that they can give you great suggestions. I might be familiar with the disease, but I might not be familiar entirely with what's happening in that county,
Hmm.
the other landowners' land. While the county agent will have a better idea, and based on that, can give a really, important suggestion on what to do next.
And so it sounds like kind of the name of the game is kind of a theme across all of these episodes, trying to proactively address incoming threats to prevent them from becoming major issues.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
So, in addition to county extension agents, what other resources might be available for private landowners?
So yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of resources out there. There is a lot of webinars that are being offered from some from the different universities, some from association like the SAF, Society of American Forester, offer all a series of webinars. I, for instance, put one together last fall about the brown spot needle blight epidemics and how to distinguish it, how to manage for it, like what are we doing to understand how to manage for it. And so a lot of those resources are out there. There's many outreach publications that are available, and those are great because they really kind of cover all the different aspects without necessarily going too much into the technicalities that sometimes, faculties like me who works on research all day might end up falling even if we try our best. And so I think there's a lot out there to educate yourself on these diseases or insects and the problems of forests. And many of them are just freely available. So it's just a click away. Others might have a little fee, but they're usually pretty accessible. So it's a great resource library out there.
Something you and I talked about in Auburn when we were there for the Southeastern Society of American Foresters meeting was this seeming deficit in forest pathologists. It seems like there is a huge demand for forest pathologists, and especially as we're trying to be very weary of potential threats and addressing our current threats, we don't seem to have as many new folks going into pathology. So for our listeners out there, if you are interested in forest pathology, there is very likely a high demand for this skill set. And folks like Caterina are doing incredible work to try and protect our forests. And speaking on that note of trying to encourage you all to get into forest pathology, I'm going to shamelessly plug that the University of Florida, we do offer a graduate certificate in forest health and resilience, and we'll soon be offering an undergraduate certificate in forest health management. And you can also look into the Landowner Academy put on by Chris Demers, which will have a forest health component here very soon. Caterina, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us. First forest pathologist, hopefully not the last. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I hope you're going to have many more forest pathologists coming and talking. We're a great crew.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Thank you for listening, and we will see you on the next one.
Thanks for tuning in. For more information, head on over to the ProForest website at proforesthealth.org. For any questions you may have, or to stay updated on all things ProForest, check out our social media at ProForestUF on X, Facebook, and Instagram. Episode hosted by Dr. Tyler Carney. This podcast was edited by Ben Ginkars Davies. The ProForest Podforest is brought to you by ProForest, Proactive Forest Health and Resilience at the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode.